Warren joins me today. Welcome, Kat.
Hey, Bill, it's good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining me today to talk about your important work, get into your books and what you're doing now. It'd be great to rewind and go back to the beginning of your of your career. Uh, you were trained as a journalist and you spent many years doing that, right?
Yeah, so that was the first career. And actually I loved being a reporter. Sort of high adrenaline, doing investigative work, fighting with newspaper editors and publishers. And then there was that moment where, and that was in the late 80s, that I took a really brief break because I was going to work on a book. And I did a gig of substitute teaching at a small college in Portland, and I really fell in love with teaching and thought, okay, if I'm going to do this, I better go back and get my PhD. So that's what I did. So when I was 35, I went back, got my PhD, then got a job at NC State when I was 40, and that was my career, for 25 years. And I
Teaching university,
teaching
training economics.
university, and then the writing stuff on the side, and of course some of the academic work needed to be part of that too, so academic writing as well.
Great, great. What was the PhD in?
It was in communications research from University of Illinois, and it was a great program. It was multidisciplinary. I mean, that this is one of those fortunate places where I had, I think, an anthropologist and a linguist and a philosopher, and a communications researcher on my PhD committee. And and a sociologist. So it was a great place to just go and read and write for 5 years.
And you lived
And
in Illinois.
well, that was the downside.
Okay.
I
And you had
mean,
to
look
say
at
goodbye to Oregon then.
Urbana-Champaign. It's the University of Illinois, and it is in the middle of cornfields and soybean
Oh, yeah,
fields.
Champaign is south. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and
So,
so, but the university itself is great, and
okay.
I mean, you could sort of live your life inside the confines of campus, and if as long as you didn't drive too far away
You're
into the
originally from
cornfields.
Oregon, right?
I
You're
am,
originally from
I am,
Oregon.
yeah, yes.
I went to college, Portland State, so that's
Oh, did
I have a
you?
fondness.
So, and
Might
I
always be
taught,
my
my
second
first
home.
gig was at University of Portland. So,
Okay.
so that was a little Holy Cross Catholic school in Portland, and a really interesting little school. But Portland State's a great school.
I had a great time there. It was I don't know how it is now. I did see things on the news but it's I know obviously like the nature out there is beautiful and it's
Yeah,
a really
yes,
beautiful.
yes.
Um, and
I still sort of miss being there because it is, you know, although it got hit by the wildfires
yes,
a couple
yes,
of years ago, that I mean, just terrible. And with climate change, we're really looking at, you know, Oregon used to be sort of a rainforest, and
yes,
now we're
yeah.
getting these sort of dangerous dry conditions. So,
Annual smoke that they're dealing with that I never
right.
dealt with that. And that was only a little bit over 20 years ago, not a long time.
Yeah,
And
a couple of years ago.
what a big what a big difference now. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so true.
So
Yeah.
so you went on after the journalism career, you went on to many years teaching university writing
Mhm.
and
Right.
doing all the other research. And how did you get into that first book? It's a nonfiction book, What the Dog Knows by Kat Warren. My 10-year-old son wants to know why you didn't write what the cat knows by
My
Kat
dog
Warren.
Warren.
He really wants to know, are you going to write that cat book someday?
I've read cat books, I've done cat book blurbs, but the cat allergies have pushed me away. Oh
Oh,
yeah,
allergic
I'm
to
just
cats.
super allergic. Yeah, it's
Okay,
really
that's a
sad.
good excuse then.
It is a good excuse.
So
It was not
how
hard.
did you get into this book? Were you always a lover of dogs?
I was always a lover of dogs. It was never my intention to write a book about them. It happened literally. I think that there were a series of, as William Corey says, a series of unfortunate and fortunate events. In some ways, the unfortunate part of this is that when I started this, it was the same time I was director of women's and gender studies at NC State. And that was an era when Art Pope and his right-wing think tanks were actively coming for programs like ours, right? And so I have to say it was just it was a kind of a rancorous time to be at the university. And simultaneously, I had this German Shepherd who was pretty impossible. And I think the vision I had was that he was just going to lie under my desk while I wrote. And the reality was is that he needed something to really focus his mind and energy. And so I fell into this work of him becoming a human remains detection dog, literally because I was trying to find something that would fulfill him. And I fell in love with the work because it is this kind of amazing combination of dog training and science and being in the out of doors and learning about these sort of interactions between dogs and humans. And then, also when you're looking for the missing and presumed dead, you're also doing the kind of work where you're trying to think through all of these sort of what comes first and next when somebody disappears, and in working with law enforcement to figure out the most promising areas to search for somebody who's missing. And I don't think, Bill, that it would have happened if I hadn't had this sort of combination moment of, I was tenured, um, and I had this dog, and it was a really beautiful way to get away from the university, and in a, I mean, not full time by any means, but literally when you're doing this kind of work, you can't think of anything else. So it's like a Buddhist practice, right? It's you have to stay in the moment, you have to stay present, you have to, you have to be there. And I think that I was really lucky to be able to do that for so many years with that particular dog, um, and doing these searches.
So the dog was solo.
That was solo,
And
yes.
how long did it take to train him to do that?
I'm a slow learner and I'm not a particularly talented trainer or handler. Solo was sort of deeply smart and driven, and it's kind of a tough dog, so that all my mistakes were like, water off a duck's back. It's like no big deal, right, for him. And I was able to sort of come in at a time when there was a sergeant in the head of the canine unit in Durham PD who was super welcoming and welcomed me in and became my mentor. And, between the Durham PD and the Durham Sheriff's units, I was able to work and train and simply by word of mouth be called out by other police or sheriff's departments in North Carolina when a dog was needed for this.
So
So
multiple departments would call you in
yes,
at
yeah,
different times.
I worked with several departments, and again, this is just I was really fortunate. And I had really talented people to train me. And then, there is this thing, who the dog is makes a big difference, because, I went on and had a failure with a dog who didn't quite have the temperament. And then I had a wonderful dog again, but he ended up with epilepsy and seizures, right? So I couldn't deploy him, even though he was, a great working dog, but you can't take a dog with seizures out. Um, it's like saying, well, I'm sure he'll be okay, but maybe.
Me, yeah, that.
Yeah, so all of those things, nonetheless, I still stayed in the field. And, to the writing part of this is that when I decided to start sort of researching and writing, because I think when Scylla was about 4, I thought about it a lot, and thought, I really want to capture some of this. And again, he was a dog where I didn't want to forget those experiences. So it ended up that was the book that resulted literally from Solo, was kind of a mashup of my loves, right? Sort of history and journalism and science and some memoir. But I mean, I think you've read the book, Bill. It's by no means 100%. It's maybe 25 or 30% of it is about Solo and that, and us going out. But I was able to, travel across the US and talk and meet with some of the best handlers and trainers out there. And it was a treat. And those relationships just have continued into the present. And I started training Solo in 2004. So this has been a sort of a 20-year voyage where it's kind of the gift that keeps on giving. Yeah.
Nice, nice. And the book came out in 2013.
Yeah,
Right.
and then 2015, the paperback came out with a little additional material, and then I can't remember. So I did a young readers
Yes, yes, I have that here.
version.
My original copy, my autograph copy of the first book, I have the hardcover, which she signed, is away in a box somewhere with I have all my signed first edition copies in a safe place right now.
Oh, that's
So I'm not
nice.
able to access them, but I did have this one handy. So
Oh,
this is
that's
the Young
lovely.
Readers edition. So,
Thank
and
you.
this was 2020. So,
Oh, that was 24.
right,
That's
I
right. I
believe,
mean,
right? Was that?
how we all lost track of time with COVID is
That's yeah, that's right.
it's like, oh,
Yeah, so
yeah.
so this
And
is
that
my
was,
son's copy. We'll have to have you sign it.
oh, that's great. That's great.
But that's a great idea to put this in because I mean obviously the first book was that it did have some serious things in it in terms of crime and things that.
Swearing. The young
Yeah,
read. I
yeah,
mean,
there's a little bit of that.
seriously, I did have to fight with the editor slash publisher about using the word jackass. Right? It's like,
Oh.
I said, yeah, but he was a jackass. I
Yeah,
have
you
to
got to
use
keep
that,
that
right?
in there.
And there is some profanity in the adult book. But I kept a fair amount. I rewrote it completely, right, for the young readers. I mean, it truly is a complete rewrite, with different chapters and a sort of a different trajectory, and sort of more using Solo throughout, so that the young reader doesn't have these long chapters on the military use of canines.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think, I mean, it's an interesting challenge. And in a way, it brought that practice brought it all back too. It was actually sort of fun to go back and because it's heavily illustrated, and there's lots of photos in there, and it was kind of fun to go back through old photos and find things that would work, right? So
Well, the original book has a lot of well, we don't want to give too much away, but there it does talk about cases and the
Yes,
successes. And is there anything
yes.
you can say without giving away too much, maybe about a particular
Well,
case that you remember?
well, I think that I worked really hard in terms of Solo in me not showing names of or providing names or enough identifying material that people would identify a victim, because um we've found somebody who was a pretty rough human being, right? But he has a family who loved him, probably, maybe, one assumes. And and so I worked very hard to both provide something that was absolutely realistic and didn't change any facts, but I didn't use names. And so, and I would say again, Bill, there's plenty of stories in there of people who have worked on really famous cases, right? Like, you remember the movie Fargo, um, the Coen brothers, and which was done as a sort of a noir comedy, where a guy puts his wife through a wood chipper. Um, and and but that was based on an actual case in Connecticut. Um, and um, and it was a case of an airline pilot who was still in prison, but who basically murdered his uh, uh, steward, air flight attendant wife, and put her in a freezer and then put her in a wood chipper along with lots of wood and spread that across the Housatonic River in winter. And so that was a case again that a human remains detection dog helped solve, because there was no body. But the dog helped find enough small parts that they had a successful prosecution of that case.
That's amazing. A wood chip.
Also, a little bit of a fingernail slash finger where they were able to
Oh,
match
okay.
the
Yeah.
fingernail polish to the
Okay.
fingernail polish in the
Just enough
cabinet.
of a piece that you
Yeah,
got
yes,
through.
and I mean, it's interesting because the f- the forensic guy on that case was Henry Lee, who
Oh, he's written
later
a
became
textbook on, yeah.
famous, yes,
Yes.
for the O.J. Simpson case, which is really ended not well, as you recall. Um, uh, may he rest in peace, I guess. I mean, a cultural phenomenon. So, but yeah, that was one of the first cases, one of the first early cases, I think, for the state of Connecticut of a successful prosecution for homicide without a body.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. Um, and yeah, and and Andy Rebman, who was the Connecticut State Police person who used his dog in that case. Uh, he'd probably done more than 1,000 searches. I mean, he had an incredibly long career, both with bloodhounds, so tracking bloodhounds, and then German shepherds that were used. A couple of them were patrol dogs, and then as human remains detection dogs. So he literally wrote the book on that, and he's still around. He's in the state of Washington, and um, and still helps advise on cases. So anyway,
So lots of dogs are used for other types of crimes other than missing people, homicides, right? I mean, I'm thinking of like not just crimes, but bomb sniffing,
yeah, I mean,
drugs.
I think you sort of and I think what's really interesting, and I'm actually working on a new book project. It's a little bit based in this notion of what are all the things that we're using dogs for? And the science of this has just, and what we know is just incredible. And the fact is that the training of dogs has become a lot better. The handling of dogs has come a lot better. And being able to sort of demonstrate the science behind it has gotten better. So, for instance, in Australia, Sydney has an entire program where they use Springer Spaniels and I think a couple working Cockers, and these dogs do water leak detection. So think about how valuable water is in Australia in this part, and quite literally these dogs, if there is if there's a pipe under earth that has a tiny little leak, and these dogs can detect that leak before they start small and then they get big, right? And then you have a disaster, right? And you lose thousands of gallons of water. And these dogs spend their days running around detecting these tiny leaks. And it's like, what about that water is different than the stuff that comes from the sky? And, there's several answers to that, but, fluoride is one of the answers as a compound that the dogs are trained to detect, but it's fascinating work.
Wow, that is amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you
Yeah.
do any water work? I know.
I did. I started him on water and he just was not suited.
It's a little
Um
messier, right? I mean, it better probably
it,
depends
it
on the
you know,
dog.
it's almost that it's a somewhat different, it calls upon different kinds of skills. So you're still talking about the same scent, but you're also having the dog, you're taking a boat across the water, or say that you think that there is a body upriver and you're downriver, you're going upriver in a boat with the dog, and the dog needs to be trained to detect on this river where the body is. And quite, if you think about this, since coming downriver, so in river cases, there have been dogs like 2 miles down, the dog says, oh my God, there's something, right? But you're working upriver until you reach that threshold where you go across and beyond the body upriver, and scent stops. The scent's being sent downriver, but you're further upriver, and the dog is going like, it disappeared. And so that's the spot where the
Oh,
dog needs to say, turn around, it's back there. And that's where you're going to look, right? Or in a reservoir. And if you think about it, bodies can move a lot, even in a reservoir. There's still currents, right? But I think that I didn't have quite the equipment or access to the kind of training where I could have done that. A couple people I worked with have really done amazing things. And Lake Tahoe, which is one of the deepest lakes in the United States, there have been recoveries that are several thousand feet down.
wow.
I
That's
mean,
incredible.
and what it is that a body, even in a very cold body of water, is going to send scent up to the surface, right? So yeah, so I think that's very interesting work. And and then there are all the other kinds of scent detection tasks that dogs are doing that are associated with COVID, or there's a guy in the United Kingdom who helped train dogs for a whiskey company um, to detect whiskey barrels that had gone off just a little bit. So this is a very,
Wow.
very large whiskey company. It's Grant's Whiskey. They also make Hendrick's gin, which I think is more familiar here. But yeah, I mean, they have some very high-end whiskey. And Stuart took it as just as a task to figure out how to train dogs to do this. And Grant's Whiskey still has a little Cocker Spaniel that goes around, right, and says, yeah, you want to check that barrel out because it'll ruin a whole batch of whiskey.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, that's really important work
That
for some
is,
of us.
yeah, that's a lot of money for them.
It was a lot of money for them. That was exactly the point.
Yeah, yeah,
And reputation, right?
sure.
So, yeah.
What is in terms of finding bodies, what is the success rate?
The success rate is that it takes a village, right? And your success is going to be only as good as the investigators. And the fact is that if you have a well-trained dog and you're searching in wilderness, you can still miss a body depending on what's happening with wind or not being able to access a place. So the answer is completely, it depends.
So many variables
So
then.
many variables. I would say, and I think that Andy Rebman, who had sort of a handle on this, 9 times out of 10, you're not going to find somebody on a search. And in many ways, you're partly trying to sort of cross off the list all the places that person isn't, right? So say somebody disappears from an apartment building and they're known to be, you realize that they have all these unpaid bills. If this is probably somebody who is suicidal, right? And so you're sort of creating this circle around the apartment and beyond, right? But you also need to think about cell phones and what if they're pinging off towers, right? That person could have left their phone and gotten in a car, right? So, but for a family or friends, it's really, really important that you look all the places where that person could be and isn't, right? If it's a farm, you want to check, all around the farm, all around all the outbuildings. And I know this sounds weirdly basic to say, well, very often you don't find somebody and you don't get resolution. The family doesn't get resolution. On the other hand, the effort that law enforcement puts into this and the rigor of the search for that person really matters. It's this odd mix. I was on a case where we looked for the victim for 2 years and finally located them.
Really? Wow.
Yes, but literally, I think we went out a dozen times.
There's a lot of land to cover, right?
A lot of land to cover and a lot of different leads. And it, in some ways, you think about those cases, because you really have to depend on law enforcement being smart and devoted to finding these victims, right?
Yeah. Has anybody ever found a body they weren't looking for?
Yes.
Really, that has
Oh,
happened.
yes. Oh, yes.
Oh, wow.
That has not been my experience, but
Okay.
yes.
Yeah.
And I actually on a couple searches was warned by law enforcement jokingly, like,
This is an
don't
area
find
where you might
anything,
find somebody else.
don't, exactly. Don't find anybody else but the victim we're looking for.
Oh,
I'm a little
wow.
rough, little rough
Yeah,
places.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, this is important work though, that really does it gives a lot of closure to families and victims and
Yeah. I mean, I think, and what people don't say enough. I mean, I think it's really hard work. I think that these days, search and rescue has become, and search and recovery, has really advanced, but it is, um, the knowledge base and the hours of training and everything. I mean, it's intense. Um, and, and I think that you have to love dogs. You also have to be sort of, um, cold-blooded about your particular dog and whether you are up to the task or the dog is up to the task, right? I mean, there's all of these things that, I mean, I'm not doing this work now, for a number of reasons, but partly because, I turned 68 on Saturday, and
happy birthday.
well, thank
Wow.
you. Thank you. Um, but in some ways too, Bill, it's why kind of switching into more of the research and also starting the work on the historic human remains detection, which is to say on burial grounds and, locating burial grounds and doing the research on those is also feels important, but doesn't have some of the urgency that you have when you have an open homicide case.
Sure.
So
So what led you into this area now? Your interest in history?
I am, and in some ways when I was, working with Solo, I did a little bit of it. It was, looking burial grounds was sort of just starting to become a thing in the early 2000s. It's come a long way. And I think part of the reason it's come a long way is that people became aware that properly trained dogs could help locate buried bodies in cold cases, right? And it wasn't that the dogs could sort of pinpoint where the skeletal remains were and like put their nose right above the grave, but that with enough triangulation and good information, the thing that was, I think, the bete noir of the FBI and investigators were what we call clandestine burials, right? And that's where the murderer takes the victim and buries them somewhere, not very deeply usually, but it can be almost impossible to locate without really good intelligence. And very often, even when the perpetrator, if they don't have their act together, and of course many of them don't, this is not CSI, um, you know, they're high on meth or whatever, and right, and then they confess and draw a really crappy map because they can't truly remember where they put the person,
Sure.
right? So it is an interesting thing that people going out on searches started realizing sometimes that their dogs were showing interest in places
Mm.
that were sort of, as you said, that thing of like not finding the body that you're not looking for, or finding the body you're not looking for. In this case, it was that, the dogs were showing this definite interest in stuff. And for instance, around really ancient Mississippian era burial mounds, which are 600 or 700 years old, right?
I was about to ask, how many years are we talking here with buried
So,
bodies?
so
Is
the
that really
nicest,
possible? Wow.
yeah, so actually, there's an archaeologist and a couple of handlers in Croatia, that did a really beautiful little study on a hillside in overlooking the Adriatic Sea. So literally a rocky hillside, and this is Iron Age. And the dogs, and this is a controlled study, the dogs helped locate burial chests that had remains in them that were 2,700 years old. So the answer is a long way back. Now, these are really well-trained dogs. These are dogs that are already being and are still being used in genocide cases in Eastern Europe because of, I mean, if you think of all the conflicts in Eastern Europe. And so these dogs were already highly trained on older burials, right? But we're talking about, you know, a farmer using a backhoe in a field and burying 10 or 12 victims with a backhoe. And if you think about how hard it is to locate something like that. And so these dogs were being used for that purpose, right? To locate victims of genocide. And so the thought experiment with this archaeologist was, how far back can the dogs go? And that's the answer.
Oh,
And what's
wow.
interesting, it wasn't necessarily the bone fragments or anything else, because the dogs actually helped locate burial chests even when the bone fragments weren't in the chest. And so, you know, you can sort of start to theorize that the dogs, I mean, this is I think limestone, that the scent of a body decomposing goes down into the rocks and down into the dirt, and that it exudes scent in a kind of island for a very, very, very long time, right? I mean, this is where dogs are being used now much more commonly in the US to find burial grounds of the enslaved, or for instance, working on former plantations that have turned into forests, right? To try to locate burial grounds there. And you know, the dogs can really help you narrow in on an area, and then you can come in with other tools, right? I mean, you're using history, you're using maps, you're using oral history, you're using the dogs, and then you're using tools when possible, like ground penetrating radar, that can come in and help identify grave shafts, which are, you know, where you've dug out, but
There must be thousands of them, right? I mean,
thousands,
hmm.
thousands, yes. And you know, and in a way, it it varies. For instance, there's a site in Richmond called the African Burying Ground, where historians estimate that there are 22,000 enslaved and freed Blacks buried there. But between highway construction and destruction, and when the Confederates were fleeing Richmond, they blew up the munitions depot that was right next to the cemetery. And, you know, I mean, it is such a desecrated site that you would think, oh my God, we can't find anything. But the fact is that the dogs went in on this just acre and a quarter that's owned by the city of Richmond and alerted in various spots, and then bringing in ground penetrating radar, there are still intact grave shafts there.
Wow.
And this kind of stuff helps, not because it's the end of the story, but because it helps be one more piece of evidence of this site needs to be preserved. we still have the remains of people on this site, and we need to find a way to memorialize and make people aware. I mean, there's an old mechanics building on that site, and the city of Richmond, in really thinking through this and consulting, that's going to be part of the memorial, right? Because it's like, you don't want to go in and put up something magnificent, because in a way, part of this is people need to know that what the terrible conditions were, and how abused this site has been, right? I mean, quite literally after the Civil War, but sort of in the 1880s, they came in to redo a street there, and they were literally digging up so many skeletal remains with this street, that what they decided was to just use those remains as fill for the street. So literally,
You're driving on
street
bones.
paved with
Wow.
bones, right?
Oh,
So,
no.
so I think that, it's interesting to know the dogs play a very tiny role here, but I think they play a very interesting role, because this is one of the, it does take a village, right? It takes African American activists and historians and descendants, and they have to fight constantly. I mean, these sites are being destroyed constantly, right? For a Walmart
Yeah. Yeah.
or a highway, or right, and you know, coming in and saying, let's figure out what happened here. And having the dogs be part of that work, I think, uh, ends up being meaningful. And also, dogs are great PR. What can you say?
Sure.
The fact is that there are lots of these sites where they would get zero attention, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But brought in dogs in Western North Carolina because the extension of the Western Carolina Railroad into Asheville was accomplished by essentially bringing in prisoners from Raleigh, the vast majority of them formerly enslaved, thrown into prison under what was called at that time the pig laws, which was basically, if you stole a chicken, you would end up in prison. If you loitered on a street, you would end up in prison. And so all of these folks basically shipped out to dig through mountains,
Slave labor.
right? Yes, they were
Prison labor.
shackled,
Yeah.
at night, at
Wow.
first in railroad cars. You know, they froze, they died of malnutrition, they died of disease, right? And so part of the work with that project was using dogs for a couple of the sites. And in a sense, the work that needs to be done is historic work. And it's also a kind of reparation work that needs to be done, right? I mean, the fact is that the expansion of the western end of North Carolina would not have happened without these thousands of men and some women being forced to work under these utterly brutal conditions. Yeah, and so did we need to use dogs? And in some ways, you like you're searching miles of track or these sites where maybe there might have been somebody who was shot in the back by a prison guard because they walked off the site, and you're not going to disinter, because the ethics of that are really questionable. In other words, I wouldn't want somebody to dig up my grandfather, right? So it's just like this, but it's an important piece of the puzzle. And the dogs help a history lesson, right? I mean, that's kind of what they provide, because mostly people love dogs. And the dogs do sort of help the process. So that's, yeah.
Sure.
But that's really, I mean, that's, some of that work is super sad, Bill, because,
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
because, we have not come to terms at all in this country with, how this country was built. And yeah, and now we're, moving backwards pretty quickly in some states.
Yes. Is there any work with Native American
There
burials?
is, and again, with the boarding schools, especially in the United States, and up in Canada with the First Nations people, have sort of talked with archaeologists up there, and there are several dog teams up in Canada that are doing really great work working with the tribes up there for locating some of the burial grounds outside the schools, where the children were removed from their tribes and from their families and put in these boarding schools. So yeah, so there is that work happening. I will say that I think ideally, the tribes themselves being able to train and use dogs is sort of the ideal. I think sort of would be an end goal, right? Um, because it's, you know, dog handlers are trying to educate themselves on some of this stuff, but if you think about the history that we have, if you think about bloodhounds, if you think about police canines, if you think about the history of law enforcement and dogs, even on reservations, it's not straightforward that you go, well, let us come in here and use our dogs, right? Some of the pointy-eared breeds, like German Shepherds and Malinois, aren't always welcome because of
Hmm.
that history. So, there's all that groundwork to do, um, but it's, there are places that it's being done and being done really well. And that gives me hope.
Right. So you've really been focused on the historical investigations these
Yeah,
days.
I would say, and and talking with and working with archaeologists and descendants. So, we have a site in Charles County that's on its Bureau of Land Management property. There's a former plantation there. The slaveholder was also a minister, a Baptist minister who baptized a kind of unknown number of enslaved people. Slaveholders brought some of their enslaved people to this person's church. And he himself, at I think at the kind of height of his slaveholding, had 14 enslaved people. And so, one of the things that Bureau of Land Management did is, it was 2 years ago, of bringing in dogs and located the burial ground. But so we know that there are bodies there, but my work now is to try to figure out if we can know who they are. But there's also the fact that we have church records, and we have descendants of the enslaved who broke off from that church after emancipation and formed a Black Baptist church that is still very active and actively researching sort of, the history of enslavement in that county. And so I have the really good fortune of working with descendants in that county to try to figure out, it's ever expanding work, but to try to figure out not just who's in that burial ground, but what were the conditions of the enslaved in that area. And then, of course, that realization always of how resilient and brave and astonishingly, I don't know, the will to survive and resist is, I mean, that those stories keep coming back, right? So, and they're really important stories. So one of the people I'm working with, her great grandfather escaped and joined the Union Colored Troops. And, and another person who was enslaved and then became a domestic servant. And then within just like 15 years, right, he became a school board trustee. He was a house builder. And you look at what people are able to do, and I find it astonishing, so that it ends up not being just a history of slavery and brutality, but it becomes a story of people's astonishing ability to survive and thrive despite it. I mean, Southern Maryland, oh my God, I think people think of Maryland as this sort of state that had all of the sort of freed African Americans, but the fact is Southern Maryland was tobacco, Confederate sympathizing, slave holding, right? And the conditions in Southern Maryland were pretty darn awful.
Well, what are you working on now? I hear you're working on a little bit of a fictional work.
Yeah, I am. It's taken a few years. And I think partly it takes me more time because I end up researching stuff and then getting stuck in the research. And
So
um
will it be a historical novel?
so it will be,
Oh,
and it's about 2/3 done,
okay.
and it is on sort of southeastern, um, uh, southeastern indigenous tribes going back to the 13th and 14th century, and sort of looking at sort of what our history is in North Carolina and in northern Georgia. So yeah, so it's a challenge, and the learning curve is steep, and there are all the concerns that you have when you write fiction and questions of appropriation. Inevitably, not in every case, but crop up, and you struggle through that and try to figure out if there's a way to write about these things in ways that are knowledgeable and don't make presumptions. That takes a couple extra years.
That's a challenge.
And who knows? For me, fiction is actually harder than nonfiction because I have a habit. Nonfiction's a habit for me. Writing nonfiction is just a habit. And fiction, I sort of figure that I can't make it up. Right? Listen, oh, you can just make it. It's like, no,
I guess you could,
I
but
don't know. You do it. I, I mean,
mine
it's,
is
it's,
very
it's a,
realist. Yeah.
yeah, and I think it's an interesting question. I mean, it's, this is my staircase, but those are just some of the archaeology books and history of southeastern tribes in North Carolina, Georgia, Florida. Um, I mean, it's astonishing the history of cities that were here
Wow. Yeah.
that were decimated
Mm.
um, with
That's
the
a
arrival of
completely different
Europeans.
approach to writing than, let's say, world building with science fiction and those types of things.
Yeah, but if I mean, I do think that, I mean, there is world building because you have to figure out what life was like,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And I think that you're talking about a kind of world building. And I think that there are some, I think some of the same qualities that you have to bring to science fiction world building and thinking about how people lived and how they survived in in 600 years ago. And I have to say that it is an escape from um the realities of politics,
At least present day.
climate change, right? And and so I don't do it for a long time every day because I'm working on some of those other projects. Um, but to the degree that you can lose yourself for a few hours in a writing project like that, that's pretty joyful.